Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. It's True Crime with Cam. Today's episode is going to be about one of the most brutal and disturbing serial killers that I have ever researched. Robert Andrew Berdella Jr., also known as the Kansas City Butcher. Robert Berdella is often compared to Jeffrey Dahmer and John Wayne Gacy because he was a gay man as well and he liked to kill other men. As always, before we dive into today's video, I do want to give a huge thank you to my sponsor, Audible. Audible has been a huge help for me find incredible resources for the research I do on these videos. Audible has the largest selection of audiobooks, ranging from bestsellers and new releases to celebrity memoirs, languages, business, and more, like original entertainment from top celebrity creators and thousands of popular binge-worthy podcasts. With an Audible membership, you can download titles and listen offline, anywhere, anytime. You can download the Audible app for free onto your smartphone and tablet and listen across devices without losing your spot. You'll also get full access to their popular catalog. It's filled with thousands and thousands of audiobooks, original entertainment, guided fitness and meditation, sleep tracks for better rests, and podcasts, including ad-free versions of your favorite shows and exclusive series. Audible members also receive 1 credit every month for any title in their premium selection. That includes the latest bestseller, the buzziest news release, the hottest celebrity memoir, or that bucket list title you've been meaning to pick up. Visit audible.com/truecrimecam or text truecrimecam to 500-500 to start exploring Audible with a free 30-day trial now. Again, that's audible.com/truecrimecam or text truecrimecam to 500-500. Start exploring Audible today with your free 30-day trial. Before I get deep into this case, I do want to give a trigger warning. I go into graphic detail about what Robert Berdella does to his victims, and I do show Polaroids that Robert Berdella took himself that were released to the public. Some viewers may find this episode too disturbing to watch or listen to, so viewer discretion is advised. I'm going to be referring to Robert Berdella as Bob, Robert, Berdella, and a combination of those, so just so everyone isn't confused, I will be using those names interchangeably. 22-year-old Chris Bryson wanted to make some extra cash, so he took a stroll down 9th Street in Kansas City, Missouri. Chris was in the area of town that a large portion of male sex workers were continuously picked up and dropped off. At 1 a.m., a man he had never seen before pulled up and asked if he wanted to party. Chris accepted this invitation by climbing into the other man's vehicle. At this point, Chris was married with a child, but he needed to support his drug abuse. The two arrived at the man's house and they walked into a place cluttered with books and magazines, antiques, paintings, all sorts of junk. The man offered Chris a beer and told him that they should head upstairs. As Chris reached the top of the stairs, the man used a 2-foot-long pipe and struck the back of his skull. The man then took a syringe and injected him with acepromazine, an animal tranquilizer. The next morning, Chris woke up in an immense amount of pain, beaten, gagged, and bound to a metal bed frame. He had a dog collar around his neck that was attached to the metal bed frame as well. It was Tuesday, March 30th, 1988, around 8 a.m., and all he could sense was footsteps approaching him as a pillowcase covered his face. 30 minutes prior to this, the man had given Chris another dose of animal tranquilizer. The man he only knew as Bob lifted the pillowcase from his face and jabbed him in the eyes repeatedly. Bob then took a cotton swab dipped in either bleach or ammonia and rubbed it directly into his eyes. He struggled as his eyes felt like they were burning out of his head. Bob left his side and returned only with an iron bar. He climbed on top of Chris and started beating him relentlessly, first starting at his hands and then making his way down to his chest. He eventually stopped beating Chris this way and moved on to another form of torture: electric shock. He attached metal clamps to Chris's testicles and thigh, as well as a transformer nearby, and started sending electrical shocks throughout his entire body. It was later discovered that this transformer can put out a total of 7,700 volts of electricity. As Chris was crying out in agonizing pain due to this torture, Bob started snapping Polaroid photos to capture the horror on his face. After Bob was done conducting his first of many rounds of torture, he administered yet again another dose of tranquilizer, as well as a small dose of drain cleaner directly into his neck. This was to make his voice very raspy and quiet it down so he couldn't scream for help. Bob told Chris Bryson that if he heard him scream again, he would inject it next time straight into his vocal box, silencing him forever. He reminded Chris of the torture he had gotten earlier and said, "What you got is nothing compared to what you can have." After Bob raped Chris, his tone with him shifted. He told him that if he grew to like and trust him, he would start doing special things for Chris, like buying cigarettes and picking up movies on the way home for him to watch. He threatened that if Chris annoyed him or tried to escape, he would simply leave him tied up until he was ready for sex again, and he would also share him with others that wanted to take advantage of a young man restrained to a bed as well. Over the next few days, Chris was in and out of a drug-fueled haze. He had thoughts of escaping, but ultimately he was terrified. Every time Bob would leave the house, he would turn the TV up so loud that Chris wouldn't be able to tell if he was coming up the stairs or not. The rape and torture continued for Chris, but one night he decided that he would do anything to escape the hell he was living in. He knew that he had established a lot of trust with Bob, so he asked that his hands be tied in front of him instead of above his head like usual. He complained that when his hands were above his head, they were cutting off his blood circulation. The next morning on Friday, Chris learned that if he worked hard enough, he could loosen his hands enough to break free. By Saturday morning, it was Chris's 4th day, and he thought about nothing but breaking free and returning to his family safely. Because the Final Four games were going on at the time, Chris had an excuse to ask Bob to leave the remote when he went off to work. Chris told Bob that he wanted to change the channels and watch all the games. Bob left the remote for him, not thinking anything of it. After he left, Chris turned down the TV to make sure he could hear if Bob was returning home. It took him 20 minutes to untie his right hand, but only seconds to free his left. He managed to free himself from the gag and untie the leash from the bedpost, but the dog collar remained around his neck. Chris grabbed a box of matches laying beside the bed and used them to burn through the 4 ropes that were restraining his ankles. He jumped out of bed and towards the window, which he assumed had to be nailed shut. Bob made it known to Chris that he was just one victim of many, so surely he wasn't dumb enough to just leave the window unlocked. But to Chris's amazement, the window opened with ease. He was on the 2nd floor, and below him was a sidewalk and a small patch of grass just past it. He hung out on the windowsill and tried to land on the small patch of grass, but ended up falling straight down onto the sidewalk. He ended up breaking a bone in his foot, but his adrenaline was so high he didn't feel a thing. A meter man from the water department was walking down the street at the time, and all he saw was a naked, bruised man in a dog collar running towards him. Chris yelled, quote, "Hey man, call the police for me. That son of a bitch is crazy. He's trying to kill me." When the police arrived, at first they thought it was just BDSM gone wrong or a gay lover's quarrel, and they didn't want to take it seriously. Chris also shifted the story because he didn't want his family knowing he was involved in sex work. He told police that he was just hitchhiking and that there had actually been a woman in the car with Bob as well. Chris was taken to the hospital and the cops staked out Bob's house. When Bob came back home, police asked him his name, and he said Bob Berdella. They immediately arrested him. They wanted to take a look inside the house, but he refused to let them search without a warrant. Bob Berdella had been arrested prior for minor violations like selling drugs and possession, and strangely enough, he had headed his neighborhood's Crime Watch Association. After the search warrant was signed by a judge, investigators arrived at Berdella's home, 4315 Charlotte Street. When authorities entered the home, they found an overwhelming amount of evidence that did far more than corroborate Chris Bryson's story. But his house wasn't easy to sift through. Bob Berdella was definitely a hoarder and had been collecting things for decades. On the 2nd story was a bedroom containing burnt rope attached to the bed frame, a transformer, bottles of pills, an iron pipe, and much more. Trace amounts of blood splatter were everywhere in the home. Bob Berdella didn't care to clean up or conceal any of his murders. One detective opened a closet door, and staring back at him on the center shelf was a human skull. On the shelf below it was 2 envelopes containing human teeth. Strange books were scattered throughout the floor, one titled Satanic Interpretation and Lifestyle, another called How to Create Poisons and the Antidotes to Them. Under the mattress in what police deemed the torture room was a plastic bag filled with Polaroids and lots of handwritten notes about what he was doing to these young men. In the photos were young men that had experienced the extreme methods of torture that Chris Bryson had gotten as well, and more. Some photos revealed that Bob had been sodomizing his victims with cucumbers and carrots. A photo that especially stuck out right away was a naked man hanging upside down. His mouth was open, and the blood had settled in his hands and arms. This would be just one of the many Polaroids that police discovered where the victim in them appeared to be deceased. Before we go into detail about the 6 victims of Bob Berdella, let's look at his life leading up to becoming a serial killer. On January 31st, 1949, Robert Berdella was born in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. 7 years later, his little brother Daniel would be born. Bob's father, Robert Sr., was of Italian descent and raised his family in a religious household. They regularly attended church, and Bob would be baptized there at the age of 12. As a young teen, Bob started questioning his religious faith as his father got deeper into it. He didn't agree with a lot of the things the church was preaching about in terms of divorce, birth control, and confession. Robert Sr. favored his younger son over Robert often for his athleticism. Robert wasn't very active at all due to his high blood pressure. Robert also claimed that his father would verbally and physically abuse him. In 1965, on Christmas Day, Robert Berdella Sr. suffered a fatal heart attack at the age of just 39. This had a huge impact on Robert, and he turned to the church for comfort, but they couldn't answer the spiritual questions that he asked. At the age of 16, he had stopped attending church altogether and became deeply cynical about organized religion overall. In 1967, Robert enrolled at Kansas City Art Institute at the age of 18 years old. This is where Robert developed his interest in all things dark and disturbing. During his college years, he also made up for a lack of attention and friends as a child by pulling wild attention-grabbing stunts. In one of them, Robert built a small maze and handed people entering a small baby chicken. At the end of the maze, he would show the participants a short film while they were holding the animal. The video featured a small chicken pecking at some food and then suddenly exploding after being shot and killed. This caused some people to involuntarily squeeze the baby chicken in their hands. This horrified the participants, but brought Robert an eerie sense of joy. As a child, Robert didn't have many friends, but he did correspond with up to 6 pen pals from all around the world, including Vietnam, Jamaica, France, Japan, and Canada. He also indulged in a lot of reading and stamp collecting. Up until his arrest, Robert collected and kept anything he could keep his hands on. Robert eventually dropped out of school in the late 60s after receiving backlash for a performance he did, which rightfully so, because he brought a live duck to campus, chopped off its head, and danced around it while chanting nonsense. After leaving school, he opened a shop called Bob's Bizarre Bazaar where he sold and traded his collectibles. He described the shop as ethnological curiosities from the world's far corners. To help pay off the lawyer fees he had accrued from drug arrests, he also started working as a short-order cook at various restaurants in Kansas City. Both of these ventures were actually very successful. He moved up to chef and eventually started training other aspiring cooks at a local community college. When Berdella settled into his permanent residence at 4315 Charlotte Street, he actually made a good impression on his neighbors and the people around him. No one knew the sheer brutality he was inflicting on young men behind closed doors. At block parties, Robert made sure to tell people not to worry if they saw young men going in and out of his house, because he was just trying to provide them guidance and be a mentor to them. In reality, some young men entered his house and never left. Berdella's longtime friends couldn't tell anything was going on either. To them, even though Robert had a cynical perspective on the world, they never saw him violent towards anyone or anything. Everyone's perspective of Robert Berdella would change when detectives started digging around in his backyard. The first thing they found was a bodiless head that still had skin and hair attached to it. But before we go deeper in what detectives discovered, let's go back to the very beginning. Robert Berdella's first victim. Robert met 19-year-old Jerry Howell through an acquaintance in the art dealing business, his own father, Paul Howell. On July 5, 1984, Robert offered to drive Jerry to a club in Merriam, Kansas, where he wanted to meet some friends. On the way, he offered him a beer and then drugged him with acepromazine and Valium. Robert tied Jerry to the metal-framed bed for 28 hours straight. He subjected him to torture, rape, and sodomy with foreign objects while continuously pumping his body full of drugs. Eventually, Jerry asphyxiated on his own vomit from all the drugs in his system and due to the gag in his mouth. Robert hung his deceased body upside down in his basement and cut major arteries to drain the blood. After most of the blood had leaked out, he dismembered the young man's body with a bone saw. He separated Jerry's body parts into different trash bags and left them on the curb for the garbage truck to take them away to a landfill. The police had tried to convince Jerry's father that he was a runaway teen, but Paul knew that wasn't the case. Paul knew that Bob Berdella was the last person to see Jerry alive, and he was telling police for years that they had killed his son, but the police would not listen. Jerry had met Berdella in the late 70s at the age of just 15, and he was very fascinated that Robert was openly gay. By the early 80s, Jerry Howell had started getting into sex work to make some extra cash. Berdella warned Jerry about the dangers of doing sex work, and even told his own father several times that his son was doing it. Paul apparently beat his son for it, which caused Jerry to not want to speak to Berdella again. Jerry moved to LA in 1983, but eventually came back just months later. He started getting into trouble with the law and turned to Bob Berdella for help. Jerry started doing small tasks for Bob, like yard work and fixing things around the house. Eventually, Jerry and Robert became close friends, and gradually even closer. They started doing drugs and having sex. Paul knew that his son was being taken advantage of, but he couldn't do much about it because Jerry was 19 years old. Paul was concerned when his son Jerry didn't return that weekend because he had bought him tickets to see Michael Jackson. Paul questioned Robert himself, and all Robert said was that he had dropped Jerry off at a 7-Eleven close to where he had picked him up. That brief answer didn't satisfy Paul, and he knew that Robert had done something to his son. He printed out flyers with Jerry's face and posted them all around town. He drove around conducting his own research because authorities weren't doing enough. He really wanted to find his son. The whole family went through a tough time after Jerry's disappearance, especially Jerry's older brother, Paul Jr. In November of 1984, Paul Jr. wound up walking up to Robert himself at his flea market booth and punching him in the face repeatedly. He shouted at him, quote, "I want to find my brother, motherfucker. You know where he is." Years later, after Robert's arraignment, after his arrest, Jerry's father would burst through the doors of the courtroom. When Robert locked eyes with him, a smirk grew across his face. Paul couldn't help himself, so he ran over to Robert and started fist-fighting him. Paul had actually brought a gun and planned on killing Berdella, but he was swiftly arrested after this, and he was given no charges. I mentioned earlier in this episode that when investigators searched Robert Berdella's home, they came across a skull in the closet. That skull would later be identified as 23-year-old Robert Sheldon's. I'm going to refer to him as just Sheldon so there's no confusion between him and Robert Berdella. Sheldon was introduced to Berdella in the spring of '83 by another man that had been living with him at the time. Sheldon roomed with Robert occasionally, but would usually drink all of his rent money and not pay Robert until it was way past due. On April 10th, 1985, Sheldon appeared on Robert's doorstep, looking to crash for a couple days. In notes marked 4-10 in Berdella's journal, he wrote 9:30, asleep. Investigators asked Berdella what that meant, and he responded that it meant that he had intentions of trying to drug Sheldon and keep him. Berdella told police that the reason he wanted to capture Sheldon was that his drinking problem and behavior had become annoying to him, and that Sheldon would just show up unannounced, expecting favors from him. He claimed that he actually didn't find Sheldon attractive, which puzzled authorities. Robert added that his impulsive behavior that started with Jerry Howell started to become a reality with Sheldon. Robert stated, quote, "You're looking at what would be some of my darkest fantasies becoming my reality, where I was capturing people, controlling them. You don't necessarily need sexual attractiveness to do that." Berdella continued drugging Sheldon that night, but actually changed his mind about wanting to capture Sheldon after bringing him to the hospital because he needed antibiotics. Sheldon returned to Berdella's that night, and the next day when Robert came home from work, he found Sheldon extremely intoxicated. This angered Robert so much that he changed his mind again, and he decided that he wanted to keep Sheldon and torture him. However, he told detectives that he didn't necessarily hate Sheldon, he just wanted to take out his frustrations that he had with other people. Berdella began his series of tortures by injecting him with tranquilizers and putting drain cleaner in his left eye with a cotton swab. At some point during the night, Berdella heated up a needle and tattooed the word "hot" on Sheldon's back left shoulder. He did this because he wanted to leave a permanent mark on his victim. He proceeded to sodomize Sheldon with a carrot and rape him anally several times. The next morning, he stuck needles underneath Sheldon's fingernails, and he got this idea from an older torture method in which people would stick bamboo underneath people's fingernails. Sheldon was the first victim to be experimented on with electric shock and also have his wrists bound with piano wire. If Sheldon did manage to escape, Robert wanted it to be extremely difficult because the piano wire was really tight and giving him a lot of nerve damage to his wrists. On April 15th, Berdella returned home to find his handyman unexpectedly working on his roof. Because he couldn't find enough drugs to knock Sheldon out, he resorted to suffocating him instead. He placed a trash bag over Sheldon's head and secured it around his neck with a piece of rope. He snapped a photo on his Polaroid and watched as the young man gasped for air. Berdella recalled to authorities that while watching Sheldon die, the only thing he was thinking about was making sure that the handyman didn't see him. The handyman ended up sticking around for another 90 minutes after Sheldon was murdered. After he finally left, Robert dragged Sheldon's deceased body up to the third-floor bathtub, where he made cuts in his joints to drain the blood. After 4 or 5 hours, Robert returned with a boning knife, bone saw, and razor blades to dismember his body. He cut off Sheldon's arms and legs, leaving the rest of the body to sit and drain overnight. Robert would later return and dismember the rest of Sheldon's body, placing them in trash bags, but he had different plans for Sheldon's head. He wrapped Sheldon's head in a separate trash bag and put it in a freezer on his back porch for a few days. Later, Robert would take it out and remove the flesh and hair and bury it in his backyard. Sheldon's skull would later be dug up and placed in Robert's closet. Robert also extracted Sheldon's teeth and put them in envelopes in the same closet. He later confessed to authorities that the day he dug up Sheldon's skull was the day he was burying the skull of another victim. Robert Berdella would take the life of his third victim just 2 months later. On the night of June 22, 1985, a severe thunderstorm swept through Kansas City, and Robert's dogs refused to stop barking towards the backyard. He went to inspect what they were barking at, and he came across 20-year-old Mark Wallace in his tool shed. Mark had been in Robert's house a few times, but the two had never exchanged any words. Robert invited the soaking wet young man into his house to warm up and dry off. During their chit-chat, he noticed that Mark was extremely drunk and depressed. Robert offered the young man drugs, and at 12:45 a.m., injected him with chlorpromazine. This drug can cause dizziness, blurred vision, and make someone prone to losing their balance. When Robert was asked why he captured Mark Wallace, this was his answer. Quote, "Aside from any emotional decisions that would have affected me, angry from some other situation or under duress, it was just that he was there. There was nothing really to link him to my house that night, and that he didn't have family that would come around looking for him." Mark had confided in Robert that his mother was out of the country, and the sisters that he did have that were in town didn't like to be around him. When Mark passed out from the first dose of drugs, Robert injected another dose and then snapped a Polaroid of him just moments later. Robert continued injecting Mark throughout the night, once with ketamine, until he noted in his journal that Mark was, quote, "out like a light." At that point, Berdella took his opportunity to undress him, tie him up, and sodomize him twice, once with a carrot. Berdella recorded that at 4 a.m. that morning, he carried Mark up to his third-story bedroom and retied him to the bed. He would proceed to sodomize the young man 3 more times. Into the early morning, Robert would continue to inject him with drugs and rape him repeatedly. Occasionally, he would also hit Mark in the back of the head with a rubber mallet to disorient him. Later in the morning, it soon became time for Robert to open his shop, Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, so he left Mark tied up and made sure to inject him with another dose of drugs just before leaving. At 5 p.m., Robert returned home and found Mark attempting to escape and free himself from the restraints. He quickly injected Mark with a large dose of drugs to weaken his ability to fight back. At 5:30 p.m., he started performing, in his own words, a bizarre kind of acupuncture and started puncturing Mark's back with needles. At 6:30 p.m., Mark Wallace was completely unconscious, and that's when Robert set up the transformer to administer electric shocks. Next, he gave Mark an enema. Throughout this torture, Robert was snapping photos with his Polaroid camera. At 7 p.m., Robert came to check up on Mark and discovered that he was no longer breathing. Detectives asked Robert what he thought was his cause of death, and he responded, quote, "I think mainly just a combination of drugs, the gag, the lack of oxygen." Berdella dismembered Mark Wallace's body in a similar fashion to that of Robert Sheldon's, draining the blood in the bathtub, cutting him up, and throwing him onto the curb like household trash to be collected. Robert Berdella was a sexual sadist. He gained sexual satisfaction from the pain and torture of others. Another serial killer that I've covered that had the same condition was Andre Chikatilo, who took the lives of over 53 young women and children. Most sexual sadists tend to have obsessive-compulsive personalities, which lead them to heavily documenting their disturbing acts. Robert Berdella took hundreds of Polaroid pictures of his victims during their torture and after their deaths. He also took notes on the specific things he did to them, such as objects he sodomized them with, and the amount of drugs he gave them, as well as dates and times. Another reason he took notes was to experiment with and see the effects of the drugs he was injecting. He wanted to figure out some sort of algorithm of drugs that would get him the right amount of consciousness he desired in his victims without overdoing it or underdoing it. During his series of interrogations, he finally revealed one of the influences of why he was committing these horrible acts. He said that he watched the 1965 film The Collector as a teenager, which left a dark, lasting fantasy in his mind. He said that there were incidents and thoughts prior to the movie, but The Collector had given him the framework to be able to fantasize it. In Berdella's words, quote, "In '84, I started allowing my dark fantasies to come true. And if you've never seen The Collector, don't worry, I'm going to give you a run-through, and you might want to skip this part if you do plan on watching it and you don't want any spoilers. A young man named Freddie, like Robert Berdella, is socially awkward and lonely. Freddie buys a rural farmhouse where he spends his time catching and collecting butterflies. He then starts stalking a beautiful young art student named Miranda, eventually abducting her on the street with the help of chloroform. He ends up holding her in his cellar, trying to get her to fall in love with him. Throughout the movie, Miranda attempts to escape numerous times, but Freddie always finds a way to keep her there. In the end, Miranda ends up dying of pneumonia after Freddie refuses to give her medical attention. The last moments of the movie show Freddie stalking a new woman, revealing that Miranda won't be his last victim. 3 months after the murder of Mark Wallace, Robert Berdella would take the life of his next victim, 25-year-old Walter James Ferris. On September 25th, Walter Ferris and Shaw apparently broke into Robert Berdella's house and kept him up until daylight. Later in the evening of the 26th, Walter called Berdella and invited him to a gay bar called the Midnight Sun in Midtown. Robert joined him at the bar at 7:30 p.m. as noted in his journal, and that's when Walter asked if he could stay at Berdella's for a few days. At that point, Robert accepted, and he decided that when Walter arrived at his house, he was not going to let him leave. Robert made dinner for Walter and himself, but added some extra ingredients to Walter's chili, crushed up tranquilizer pills. This was also in combination with the 2 Valiums that Walter had taken beforehand. Walter was unconscious within minutes of finishing his dinner, and that's when the real horror began. After Walter was bound and gagged, Robert proceeded to sodomize him with his finger, penis, a carrot, and a cucumber. Towards midnight, Walter started to regain consciousness and fight back against Robert. That's when Robert started shocking him on his shoulder, buttocks, and testicles. He also used the same bizarre acupuncture that he had used on Mark Wallace, but in much more sensitive areas. His torture continued throughout the night and into the morning until 11 a.m. when he had to open his shop. When Robert returned home from work, Wallace's temperature was at 99 degrees, so he gave him an injection of penicillin. Detectives questioned why Robert cared to give the slightest bit of medical attention after subjecting them to such horrible torture. He claimed it was to, quote, keep him from getting worse or possibly dying. In reality, this was probably to prolong the torture and sexual assault he could inflict on his victims. In Robert's journal, beside 12 a.m., he wrote 86. If you work in the service industry, you probably know the term 86, meaning an item you're out of on the menu. It can also refer to a particular person that isn't allowed at the bar or restaurant. Robert had worked in the restaurant industry for so long that he started to use the term 86 to refer to when one of his victims was dead. By midnight on September 27, 1985, Walter Ferris had died of either overdose, asphyxiation, or a combination of the two. Berdella repeated the process of what he had done with his two previous victims, and in the end, watched as Walter's remains were taken away by the garbage truck. 23-year-old Todd Stoops met Robert Berdella in the spring of 1984. Todd was heavily addicted to drugs at that point and used sex work as a way to get quick cash. When Todd moved to Kansas City, he met and married a young woman named Rachel, and the two of them moved into Berdella's home. He and Rachel would move in and out of Berdella's home a couple times, and usually it would end in Berdella kicking him out because of their drug habits. I guess Robert only liked people using drugs in his house when it was forced by himself. The last time Mr. Stoops had seen his son was in the spring of 1985 when he saw Todd jogging around in the Midtown area. However, the last time Todd Stoops was seen by anyone was on June 17, 1986. He was hanging out at Liberty Memorial Park before getting into Robert's car around 11:30 a.m. Todd talked to Berdella about how he hadn't seen him in a year because he was in jail, and he also mentioned that he and his wife Rachel had split up. Back at the house, Todd shot up a mixture of Ritalin and Talwin, while Berdella made a peanut butter and jelly sandwich laced with crushed up tranquilizers. Robert told investigators that the reason he had captured Todd Stoops was because he was very sexually attracted to him, and he assumed that because Todd and his wife had split up, no one would come looking for him. Todd was held hostage for a total of 2 weeks and underwent a series of tortures similar to past victims. He was bound, gagged, drugged, shocked, sodomized, raped, and beaten repeatedly at the pleasure of Berdella. All of these incidents were either photographed or written down in his journal. Todd Stoops specifically had to undergo a lot more sodomy than past victims, which would eventually lead to his death. Berdella used different vegetables to rape Todd, and eventually his own fist, which led to Todd's anal wall being ruptured and causing him to bleed heavily. On July 1st, Robert gave Todd a bath and ended up strapping him to a chair to see if that could help him breathe better. When Robert returned to check on him later, Todd Stoops was dead. He, again, like other victims, dismembered his body with a bone saw, and Todd's remains were taken away by the garbage collectors on July 7th. A forensic pathologist would later testify at Berdella's hearing that Todd's anal wall being ruptured caused septic shock, which was the official cause of death. In the spring of 1987, Robert noticed a man walking around downtown Kansas City. 2 weeks later, that same man, 20-year-old Larry Pearson, would come into Robert's shop and the two of them would hit it off. Berdella started picking up Larry every time he saw him walking around, and occasionally Larry would stay over at his house. On June 5th, Larry was arrested for indecent exposure, and 2 days later he phoned Robert Berdella and asked him to post his bond. He agreed, and Larry would end up living with Berdella for the next 2 weeks. Over that time, Berdella noticed that Larry didn't seem to care to pay rent or get a job, and this extremely frustrated Berdella. One night the pair went to see a movie, and on the way back, Larry mentioned to Berdella that he used to rob gay people down in Wichita. Berdella told investigators that he was basically bragging about it, and as a gay man himself, that's when he formed the opinion to capture Larry and make him his next victim. When the two returned home, Larry wasn't feeling well, so Berdella used this opportunity to give him tranquilizers and claim it was antibiotics. The tranquilizers ended up just making Larry very tired, so Robert challenged him to a shot contest. They had a total of 15 shots each. Larry ended up passing out at 6:25 p.m., and this led Robert to inject him with chlorpromazine and begin a torture log that would amount to 24 pages. Not only did Berdella take the most notes on Larry Pearson, he was also the most photographed. During Larry's captivity, Robert would act out the same pattern as he did with past victims, keeping him drugged, gagged, beaten, shocked, and tortured. Larry was bound with piano wire around his wrists, and Robert would occasionally beat his hands with an iron bar to make sure that it would be very difficult for him to escape. At one point, Larry asked how long he was going to be Robert's sex slave. Robert's response was, "Don't ask," and after that, Larry started referring to him as, quote, Master Bob. On August 5th, while Larry was forced to perform oral sex on Robert, he bit down on Robert's penis so hard that it caused a severe laceration. Robert made an assault report against Larry Pearson at a hospital and tried to press charges, which would in turn give him an alibi that he wasn't associating with Larry at all. The doctor told Berdella that they were going to have to keep him there for a few days. Robert told them that he had to make sure his dogs would be okay first. He went home and checked on his dogs, as well as checking on Larry, who was still passed out after Robert had beaten him in the head with a stick. Berdella then made the decision to, quote, put him to sleep by putting a plastic bag over his head and suffocating him to death. Robert did all of this while a cab was waiting outside his house to take him back to the hospital. Robert had held Larry for over 6 weeks, longer than any other victim he had held before. When he returned from the hospital, because he was still healing, he had to rely on a chainsaw to dismember Larry. Robert made the decision to keep his skull, which would later be found in his backyard and linked to 20-year-old Larry Pearson through dental records. Authorities had only found 2 skulls on Robert Berdella's property. The other victims were untraceable due to the fact that they had been buried in landfills for years. The prosecution ended up giving Berdella a deal, a guilty plea and confession to the rest of the murders in exchange for taking the death penalty off the table. Berdella accepted this deal, so a public trial never took place, and Robert was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After the sentencing, the prosecution gave this statement to reporters. Quote, "It was unlikely that had we gone to trial, we would have found out the truth in each of these cases. And if we got the death penalty, we don't know that we could have kept it." Many people wanted to know why Robert Berdella tortured, murdered, and dismembered 6 young men over the course of 3 years. And he claimed that he wanted to know the answer to that question just as much as everyone else. He said, quote, "Why the hell do people think I know? Do they really want to accept and believe that I planned all of this, that I thought it out?" During one interview, he claimed that it might have been because he wanted to end the type of lifestyle his victims were living, which was, for most of them, sex work and/or substance abuse. A psychologist named Helen Morrison, who had interviewed John Wayne Gacy and Wayne Williams, theorized that Robert had difficulty developing in early life. She said, quote, "In early development, sex and aggression are mixed together. This fusion is something that most people theoretically are born with close together. Only with time do they develop into separate elements. But with serial killers, these elements never separate, and they also never progress to the stage of sexual identity." Other psychologists theorized that Robert was taking out the physical and verbal abuse that he suffered from his father out onto his victims. Robert would first take care of his victims by giving them a place to stay and buying things that they desired out of his pocket. But then Robert would flip a switch and become a predator that dominates them. Berdella had fantasies for years that escalated in terms of violence and intensity, and once he made those fantasies become a reality once, he couldn't stop. It's fair to say that if Chris Bryson hadn't managed to free himself and escape, Robert Berdella could have easily doubled or tripled his amount of victims. The police and Robert Berdella's neighbors and friends had no idea about the atrocities he was committing. All of Robert's victims' families were concerned about their whereabouts despite what Robert thought. Several families went to police after their family members disappeared, but the police always theorized that those young men had run away. Specifically, if the young man was involved with sex work or had a history of arrests involving substance abuse, and the police didn't want to use their resources to find them. On October 8, 1992, Robert Berdella was sitting in his prison cell and complained about chest pains. He was rushed to the hospital and within 2 hours had suffered the same fate of his father, dying of a heart attack at the age of 43 years old. That same year, before Robert Berdella's death, he had contacted his counselor saying that the prison staff was withholding his heart medication. When the judge who sentenced Robert Berdella to prison heard about his death, he said, quote, "Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy." Alright, that is the case of the Kansas City butcher, Robert Andrew Berdella Jr. Some of you were commenting on my last video saying that the audio wasn't loud enough, so I bumped it up a lot and I hope that worked out. I also didn't use a red light, and if you see on TikTok, I use a red light all the time. But I figured that this would just be a little bit easier on your eyes. So I will continue to just use a regular light. I plan on getting a ring light eventually. If you want to keep seeing more videos from me, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe if you haven't already. And also, please comment below any cases that you want me to cover because I'm running out of ideas. Make sure you follow me on Instagram, True Crime Cam, and TikTok at True Crime Cam as well. And thank you guys so much for 1 million followers on TikTok. That is freaking insane. I'm gonna start getting on a schedule after this video and trying to upload once every week, maybe every 2 weeks. And hopefully I will see you guys next week.
I kept sheets of paper that I had made some notations on. This is between the mattress and springs on my bed. This is one of those packages containing numerous photographs and what became to be known as meticulous, methodical diaries. Those pieces of paper in there are these meticulous diaries.
These are the pictures of the more than 200 photographs, some of them of young men, sexual partners, and these are in some ways, and these that we see here are the sheets of paper upon which you made notes.
Right.
See.
This is a copy of one of those pages.
It looks like a loose leaf paper. It does contain information about amounts of drugs and so on. So what is your complaint with the police calling these detailed diaries?
By your evaluation, does this look methodical?
Doesn't look methodical.
Meticulous?
It looks a little sloppy.
They are not the bound in Corinthian leather, written on parchment diaries that the media apparently tries to describe them as. The sheets of paper.
Did you feel when you learned that not long after your arrest, the local radio stations, 2 of them at least, were running a Bob Berdella parody song and were asking people to come to parties wearing dog collars?
Well, I think the newspaper article reported that even the families of the victims were upset by the song. I have never had a chance to hear the song. I had also been told when I first came into jail that the Fox radio station had run a promo giving prizes to their listeners if they showed up at the station in a dog collar and with a leash on. The people here in the institution, the correctional officers, the caseworker, even the psychiatrist, were, I think, surprised to find out that that upset me.
And it did upset you?
Very much so.
You recall we mentioned before that there were reports in the Westport flea market where you had your shop that people would say, oh yes, I do remember he had these strange smelling dishes of food, that he had bead bones. And later on there was speculation, at least in the community and in some aspects of the media, that the remains of your victim were somehow being transported and prepared as meals and prepared as jewelry in your shop.
I was quickly able to identify to the police the other dealers in that section of the market where we rotated potluck rather than eat the flea market food again. And that you could question any of these people, and they'd be able to tell you that the food was good. There was nothing suspect about the turkey or ham or beef that was in these dishes.
I want the police to explain why they allow the loved ones of families to die in the convenient area of 10th and McGee.
I don't think any family of my victims or anybody else that has been killed down related to 10th and McGee are going to be happy to find out that their loved one is basically written off by the police as far as investigations go, etc., because they died in a convenient neighborhood. The police knew what was going on, so it's no big deal.
And that accounts for your remark to me, and I don't mean at all to make light of it, that I killed 6, but they, the police, by allowing this to stay open, they killed more.
Yes. This has been something that's been going on for over 20 years, to my knowledge.
It seems to me that you're suggesting that had the police done their job, Had they followed the leads, had they really been on your case prior to April 2nd, 1988, they would have caught you, and some of this suffering could have been prevented.
Maybe not caught me. Scared me off, maybe. Prevented things from happening after Hal? Definitely.
In a way, do you wish they had? There was a report in the Sunday Kansas City Star in December about the dangers you might face after you leave the Jackson County Correction Facility and are moved to another larger prison. How do you feel about reports like that? Do they make you anxious?
They give me some reason for concern, but one of the reasons I'm concerned is that these were not just reports. These were digging out quotes from unnamed prosecutors implying that the inmates down there are waiting to get their hands on me. I am at this point am less concerned about the inmates acting on their own as opposed to the inmates or an inmate acting in response to maybe some directive or coercion from some police officers.
Do you think you're being set up, perhaps?
Well, I think the Star and Times have, since they haven't been able to get a court to put me to death, are now trying to get the inmates to do it for them.